Hey, what's up, everyone? Welcome to another episode of Coach's Corner. Today's topic is what are fundamentals? So, I think this is obviously a pretty abstract topic. I think we'll probably all have different opinions on it. Really excited to get into it. But before we get into it, if you do enjoy the content, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And give us a like on Spotify as well if you're listening on Spotify. And of course, the best way to support us is to subscribing to our Discord where you can ask questions. We actually do have a question before we get into the topic. So, Ramses, if you could go ahead and read the question off and we can get started.
Yeah. So shout outs to Alto for a very, very interesting question. I think a lot of people can relate. Um, the question goes as follows. I think I can speak for a lot of people when I say that losing is very frustrating, especially in a tournament setting. More recently, I failed to make a top cut in a Yu-Gi-Oh tournament due to two losses that really hurt my tiebreakers, but I know were completely in my control to win. I was frustrated, but my friend helped me through it by letting me vent about it all. But it made me curious. What advice would y'all give to the average tournament goer? And how do you deal with impactful losses that were completely in their control? And what do y'all think would be a good way to help them grow from their losses? So I think it's a really good question. Basically, what do you do when you lose knowing that you could have won? Because those are the toughest losses, right?
Oh yeah, yeah, for sure. And for me, what usually is the case is you drop like in the perspective of Smash or maybe even Yu-Gi-Oh, maybe I mean with card games in general, it's like, oh, okay, I went down this route when I should have gone on this route for my combo tree or something like that. Obviously for Smash, there's usually like confirms and combos that are you drop under pressure and stuff like that. So I think the most common one is doing X under pressure, where you usually perform that pretty well, not under pressure, but you didn't that time under pressure at a tournament, and then you lost because of it, which is on you. I think the main thing to take from any kind of frustrating loss is, well, from any loss, it gives you information on what you need to work on under pressure. So I think that is something that you can actively practice, even if you have to go to a local or some other tournaments, right? To put yourself in the environment in which you don't perform those things well. So this topic can get a little deep and into the woods because it's performance anxiety is just like, that's going to happen to any competitor, right? So I think when you're thinking about just dropping things under pressure and stuff like that, it's going to be pretty tough overall. And the main thing is that if you're in tournament, you don't let it affect the rest of your tournament. So if you get frustrated and you still have like a bunch more rounds of Swiss or you still have losers bracket, to be able to have a short memory and just move on. I think the snowball effect is where it's going to get really, really tough if you have to deal with it. So in my opinion, I think the main takeaway is to not let it affect the rest of your tournament run and to use the information to work on like said thing you made a mistake on, right? So no one's going to play perfect, but you just want to take the information, move on from there, and especially the main thing is to not let it affect the rest of your tournament run within that day or within that weekend or anything like that. That's the main piece of advice I would give. You never want it to kind of spiral and like ruin your whole tournament.
For sure, for sure. I think that is the most important like practical effect is that you stop the error there and don't let it bleed over. I think in terms of reflection, something to consider is the degree to which you had control. And so realizing that you had control is one thing, but the reason you lose is often the things you could have controlled, but you didn't. And so saying, oh, this loss was in my control, sure, it's a good realization, but it's not something that is actionable. And so what I recommend is to reflect on how much control you actually were exerting, and also to not let yourself get essentially disillusioned or no illusioned to get yourself let yourself get confused by the fact that you felt like you had control, whereas in reality the true issue is that you did not have control over the things that you should have controlled. And so oftentimes having a little bit of control makes you feel like, oh, I should have focused on that control harder, whereas the real issue is there were other areas that you should have been controlling. And so oftentimes if you lost and you felt like, oh, the loss was entirely my control, don't focus on the control that you had and that you didn't act on, but try to still look for the areas that you could have been controlling that you didn't. And so most of the time, that's where most of the error lies. It's not in like, oh, I got a lot of landing mix-ups and I didn't really like mix it up well enough. No, it's about all the times that you maybe dropped your edge guard or didn't juggle properly or misspaced, etc., etc. And so try to look for as many avenues, as many dimensions, as many dynamics as possible in which you can exert your control, and don't hyper focus on the part that you knew you could control, because if you knew you could control it, there you probably did about as well as you could for your level. And at the end of the day, the goal is to push your level. And so that's one part, is to make sure that you don't hyper focus on what you already know. And outside of that, of course, do try to reflect on why you struggle to control the areas in which you know you could control the game. Because oftentimes there are aspects of control that you're missing, right? So for example, let's say, again, like I got these landing mix-ups and I'm just like not pushing them as well as I could be. There's a very, very good chance that there's more to this field of control that you're not catching on to, that you should be factoring in the future to make these choices better. And so let's say, oh, I know I had like these landing mixes, but I just couldn't like capitalize on them properly to drag home a win. Why? Like, what were you missing? Were there like specific tells that you should have been tuning into, information you should have gathered? Was there context that you didn't focus on well enough? And so further understanding why you couldn't exert the control that you knew was possible is very important, because oftentimes if you know, that's one step, but knowing is only half of it. A lot of skills are extremely multifaceted. And so there are people who, like, for example, if you're very knowledgeable about King K rule and I show you the best King K rule in the world, you can probably give me a decent explanation for why this K rule is making the choices that he's making, but you cannot emulate the choices because you're not the best King K rule in the world. So you ask yourself, okay, well, what skills am I missing to actually be able to put all of this knowledge into work? And so understanding the various aspects or the various like sub skills that go into a skill is very important too. And so oftentimes if you know something, it's not enough. You also need to recognize, you need to understand the context, you need to you need to read the opponent. There's a lot that goes into any given skill. And so that's what I recommend, is to not focus on what you know, not focus on what you know you're already aware of and you're already doing, but instead try to broaden your horizons as much as possible and try to understand more of the context that lets you perform well within that given dynamic. What do you think, Tony?
So I'll go ahead and reiterate that you want to take the loss as the loss and nothing else. Essentially, every game you play should be the first and last game of its own consideration. Every match you play should be the first and last match. Whatever happened before doesn't matter. Whatever is going to happen next doesn't matter. There's only the present. So focus on whatever you have, and then it's a skill, but you want to practice leaving that behind you as soon as you're done. It doesn't matter whether you win or lose. This is also part of the reason why it's so important to record, whether that's with a phone, have a friend transcribe it, whatever. If you need to write down the game, and within the context of Yu-Gi-Oh, I'm not sure if there's a prohibition of a friend recording it with their phone, but the idea here is if you don't have something of that nature to record it, then you would want to essentially write it down while it's still fresh in your memory. And then once it's written down, it's gone. It doesn't exist anymore. And that's a problem for you to readdress once you're back home. But while you're at the tournament, there's only the match that's coming in front of you. There's only what's in front of you and nothing else. So keep tunnel visioned on your goals and don't let yourself be distracted by anything else. Now, with that said, I'm going to offer a couple of reframings on what a loss means itself. So first of all, when you say I won or I lost a match, my perspective is that winning or losing at tournament isn't the goal, even if it is what you want. So the idea here is that you can't always control whether you're going to win or lose a game. And so if you did have control over you win or lost, that's just a coincidence. And so the idea is whether you are playing against, say, a Pool's Joker or MK Leo's Joker, that's not something you can control. And so the idea here is you want to focus on the things that you can consistently pursue, the things you can consistently progress. That way you can actually judge your own progress in a consistent manner. And this allows you to have feedback based on your results because you look at the things that you do always have control over. So it sounds like that's probably a case of you had a proactive total control, or rather there was maybe a combo turn that you had where it was just a simple matter of your technical ability. So rather than view it as this was the end point of the match and I was supposed to display my technical ability, your technical ability is a side effect. So the idea here is that instead of looking at it as I want to win or lose a tournament match, focus on what the people who win those tournament matches look like, what they do, what their routine is, and then try and emulate that process. And so the idea here is you want to focus on, well, who does have the technical ability to consistently follow up on this combo in this case? And odds are pretty high that they do other things more so, and that coincidentally they also execute that combo when it comes up. And so in this case, it would be a matter of if I'm dropping my combos, well, if you're only practicing getting a combo 5 times in a row, maybe you should escalate that, try and get it 6 times in a row, 10 times in a row. And the idea here is you want to progress your actual skills, your specific skills in a way so that the things that you viewed yourself as having control over are, even at their worst, more likely to come up. So in other words, if you have an engine and what you really want is heat to come off of the engine, let's say you're cold at home and you just have this engine to heat you up. If you say, I'm still cold and the engine is going, well, the answer to that isn't to stop running the engine. The answer is you focus twice on the engine, see if it needs more fuel, see if you need to just let it run longer. And as a natural side effect, eventually it will heat up by focusing on the actual process, the engine, literally and metaphorically in this case, of the development. And so, in other words, if you follow the process, you're actually following an explicit process here, then again, winning and losing is going to be a side effect of that. Your combos are going to be a side effect of that. And if you see that your combos aren't a side effect of it, then your process is probably not something that is going to meet your goals in the first place. And you need to look for a process that is going to find your goals a little bit more directly for you. And so that's my perspective on that. Alternatively, another way to look at it is to just ignore losses altogether and view losses as a mechanism towards that process. And so in this case, the whole point of going to tournaments is so that you can see what your skill is going to look like on a debuff, essentially. No one ever plays well in tournament, or rather, playing well in tournament is a matter of having essentially a negative modifier all the time. So you'll never play one-to-one what you're going to do in a comfortable environment. So with that debuff applied to you, where are your skills lacking? Where do they need to develop? And so the idea here is, again, to go back to the engine of the process, once you have seen yourself playing at your worst and you see what things are the weakest when you're playing at your worst, now you know what to practice focusing on and specifically progressing when you're playing at your best. Because if you're getting everything 100% of the time in your practice, but then you're going into bracket and not getting everything 100% of the time, pick the worst things. So keep it manageable. I usually recommend just picking the 3 most repeated mistakes. And then essentially these modal mistakes are going to be emphasized in your practice. If you need to cut back on things that you're not dropping in tournament to make more time for the things that you are, then do that. Don't neglect them completely. Keep getting your 5 out of 5, 10 out of 10 practices. But then if you are dropping things that you wouldn't normally drop in bracket, then go for 15 out of 15, 20 out of 20s on those and cut everything back down, or everything that you're consistently getting back down to 5 to 5s, because it's usually easier to maintain skill than to progress your skills. It requires more volume to progress them and improve them. So this is part of the learning process. I also recommend don't take it personally. You are essentially, or rather your tournament self is a function of the rest of you. And yes, they do acquire your goals, and maybe you just want that high of having the victory. But at the end of the day, what you ultimately are going to do that makes the most effective hypothetical version of yourself is the one who isn't attached to the winning or the losing, which It's a lot easier said than done. It is multiple skills that you have to practice. It usually takes a lot of life experience to progress yourself through that point with very conscious attempts to do so. So, good luck with that. I think that's a journey that everyone in this call is also working on themselves. And it's something I know I personally will probably be working on for the rest of my life. So,
Yeah, that's the plan for sure. So
It's a journey.
it's
yes,
all,
sir.
it's all about the journey. So let's get into the main topic, which is what are fundamentals. For me, I'll go ahead and start things off. I think fundamentals is a term that's thrown around in general in Smash quite a bit, and I think what to me what it is when you look at older Smash games, right? What skills did it take to win in said older Smash game? So that's what I think fundamental skills are, because the fundament like on a technical standpoint, the fundamental skills in every Smash game is going to be different. It just depends on what's strong, right? So for example, how you roll in Smash 4 is fundamentally more important than how you roll in Smash Ultimate. How you spot dodge in Smash Ultimate is fundamentally more important than how you spot dodge in Smash 4, because spot dodging has literal frame advantage in Ultimate, and rolling is just a lot better, and it didn't decay in Smash 4, right? So I obviously this is the fundamentals is a super broad term, and it's obviously opinionated, but when I think back on so I started playing Smash competitively in Brawl. I mean, I went to a couple tournaments in Melee as a kid, but I never well, like I didn't I never deep dived into that game competitively, but for me, my journey started off in Brawl. So like when I think of fundamental skills, I'm thinking more of like what skills were used in Smash 4 and Brawl. That's what I'm thinking. Uh and for me, it's going to be things like I think spacing and movement are the two main fundamental skills in Smash. It's like where are you moving and how are you throwing out your hitboxes to be safe. Now in Ultimate, it doesn't matter. There are so many things that are safe on block that it doesn't matter where you space things. And that's one thing that's very irritable to me in Smash Ultimate, which is it's like, oh wow, so like in previous Smash games, I would have to throw out this back air and it had to be spaced. But in Ultimate, I can throw out this back air and I can like cover myself with a spot dodge or like dash back because everything's so safe. So all of a sudden, like spacing still matters in Ultimate, but spacing mattered way more in older Smash games, right? As to where one thing I will give it up to Ultimate is that the movement is a lot more faster and dynamic. So, um, you know, and then like even movement. So movement in Ultimate, I think, is better overall, but movement in Smash 4 was just harder to execute. So you could have advanced movement in Smash 4, but it was literally a skill check every time you did a perfect pivot, right? So I like it when there's movement tech. I like it when there's like just a skill barrier, and it's not anything crazy like Melee where the skill barrier is extremely high. But even if there's like a soft layer, right? But in Ultimate, there's no soft layer, and the reason for that is, so it's easier for people to pick up and play. Obviously, if you're a veteran, that's just like I think knee jerk will kind of annoy you because you've put in so much work in previous Smash games to grind certain tech to out outskill your opponent in a movement thing or whatever. But yeah, so to me, and I think overall it's a better thing for Ultimate, right? Like making it easier to pick up. It's why the game's so popular. So to me, it's I would say movement and spacing for sure. And I mean, there's all obviously like other fundamental Smash things like edge guarding is still a thing. It's a little harder to do in Ultimate, but it still should be a thing, and it still is a thing. So excluding obvious things like edge guarding, juggling, ledge trapping, like all the advantage state neutral. I mean, I guess spacing and movement falls under neutral, but if I had to say something, it would I think spacing and movement for me is what my perspective is, and I obviously gave my reason for that perspective. It's kind of just like the older thing that really mattered in previous games. But I will say, I think movement is a lot more dynamic in Ultimate, and it's a lot more common, and a lot more characters can move and can jump because of the jump squat being taken, like, or being balanced and stuff like that. And unit collision also nerfing faster characters so they can't move through you. So, as an older Smash player that's like, man, there's some things that like kind of don't need fundies for anymore. It's like that is true, but I will say that Ultimate also kind of elevates some of the other fundamental skills like movement that we don't really have any. And I guess the other thing that I feel like a lot of players will say is not fundies, but has technically been in previous Smash games is zero to deaths. So obviously we had chain grabs before. So, I mean, getting electric from Kazuya, getting grabbed by ice climbers in Brawl, getting grabbed in ice climbers from Brawl is more consistent technically, right? At least Kazuya, there's
It
like
is.
certain parts where it's like more of a 50-50 if you're end up on a platform or not and stuff like that. So I don't know. I think because of the volatile punish game that Ultimate has across the board for a lot of characters, I think that's where people are kind of like, well, that's not fundamentals or whatever, because I just got hit once by Luigi or Kazuya and I just, got deleted or whatever. Or I got hit once by Steve, took 80 or got deleted.
Mhm.
So I think the punish game is another thing to be discussed when it comes to what are fundamentals, right? And I think I don't
What
know.
do you think, Charles? Is a Kazuya zero to death? Is that fundies?
I mean, it's just an execution on a zero to death. That's the way I see it. The thing that like
You're
makes
dodging the question. Is it fundies?
I think it doesn't even I don't think punish game really pertains to fundies, but I know that's something a lot of
Okay,
people say. But
good
I
take.
don't I don't think that the actual punish game, because that's something we've had in a lot of Smash games. Like, oh,
For
this
sure.
character does X to you, you're fucked. Like you're gonna lose your
Mm,
stock or whatever, right? So I don't think the punish game. What to me,
I
what
agree.
frustrates me about Kazuya, and I could say that's like doesn't make him fundamental, is like this dude's like invincible half the time. This, you know what I'm saying? Like that's the kind of stuff to
Yeah,
me that's more concerning when it
it's
comes to
not
like
fundy.
that's not fundamental. Like it's like, oh, okay, well, if I'm invincible half the time, then I have like there it doesn't feel like the opponent can press a button and all they can do is run away. And to me, it's like when anyone plays Smash, they want to hit their buttons. Obviously, you still want to have discipline to not hit buttons and stuff like that, right? Especially in Ultimate, where like throwing out buttons is so good. But yeah, to me, what makes Kazuya quote unquote not fundamental is just how he's invincible half the time and all that other jazz. It's more of like the invincibility and the armor than the damage output. Because if he wasn't invincible and didn't have armor, obviously he would like suck way more. But at least would feel like you could fight him more. And I mean, I don't really play characters with disjoints, so maybe that's just my perspective as a Fox player. But yeah, I mean, to me, it's more of just like being coded in invincibility, and I can't really think of other Smash characters that have that mechanic in previous Smash games. I think like maybe the closest thing
The
is Smash 4 Ryu with like invincible Shoryu and stuff like that. But
Bayu witch timing a projectile and running at you.
yeah, yeah, there's a Smash
That's
4
like the
that does.
closest thing, but yeah, no, yeah, I get you. I get you entirely.
So that part to me is where it's like you're bringing in mechanics into the game that really didn't exist before, and I think that's another thing too, uh like stray mechanics that are brought into the game that are like, oh whoa, this is a whole new twist. But to be fair, that's what keeps the game fresh. That's how
Mhm.
they can bring in new characters. So I mean, it's not like Nintendo's trying to please like the less than 1% of competitive players, right? Like they're trying to sell the game. So I at the end of the day, it's just like I'm just someone that's in this very small demographic that's old and grumpy, right? That's like how I view it. So
Brawl players.
yeah, pretty much, right? Where it's like, oh well, like did quote unquote this isn't Smash, and it's like, well, what is Smash? You know what I mean? Like that's such a weird way of putting it. But I mean, obviously, like Steve mining and all that other stuff, right? And then, um, walking and throwing out tilts, Min Min and Steve being able to like move around and throw tilts out that are like safe on block and stuff like that. It's just not to me, those are new mechanics that don't feel quote unquote fundamental because they were never fundamentally in Smash in previous Smash games. So those are the kinds of mechanics that are like
Well,
feel more whack and stuff like that. Or like Min Min's absurd range. Like we've had crazy range
yeah.
before, but like that just that's ridiculous. And being the
I,
whole
I,
like double like two arms mechanics, like I throw out one and then I can throw out another attack, or I don't have to throw out the other arm and stuff like that. So those like more Fighter Pass 2 mechanics that are kind of out of this world. I mean, I guess they're like we've had Arsene in Fighter Pass. I'm trying to think of like the craziest like ultimate newcomer or like Fighter Pass 1 stuff. It's probably just pre-patch Arsene, right? Stuff like that. So
I
those things I
guess.
would
Yeah.
probably throw in the bucket too as non quote unquote fundamental at the time.
I mean, hero menu,
Oh, hero menu's another one, yeah.
hero menu,
That's
and that
fucked up.
almost got him banned. So I mean,
Yeah. So I mean, I think those like the newcomer mechanics for new fighters in Smash, I think are something that a lot of people will knee jerk and be like, that's not fundamental or that's not Smash, right? Because it's just new to the game, obviously. So everyone's got to learn it, but it it's weird because it almost feels like you're at a disadvantage if you know all the previous other stuff, and then you kind of like you're unlearning something is way harder than learning something, right?
yeah.
So that's why I always give it up to the veterans. Any veteran of any previous Smash game that still can remain relevant in Ultimate, props to you because that is
That's hard.
very difficult. It is very, it's so much harder to unlearn something than having a fresh new palette and then just being like, oh, okay, cool. Like I'm just learning this and you just go, right? So yeah, I guess that's my general take on fundamentals. What do you think, Ramses?
Okay, so I'm gonna flex my background in this regard. So I graduated in fighting game design, and so I've been thinking about the definition of fundamentals for the better part of like 10 years now.
Oh snap! You're really ready
And
for this episode.
I was ready for this episode. Like, you know what the crazy thing is?
Started early.
Only like half a year ago did I find a definition that I think actually works, and so it's funny. I've played a lot of competitive games, and so the way I kind of found a definition that works for me, at least, is that I thought about other games, right? So take something like chess. What are chess fundamentals? And realistically, like chess only has fundamentals, right? There's no like chess. Nothing in chess doesn't belong in the game. And
I
so if you
charged my
think
limit
about
so I
it,
can move twice in a row.
bro, imagine like a fucking Super Saiyan glow on your queen, and she just goes. No, but the point is, there is some degree of like I actually looked at discourse, and there is some degree of people like getting salty, very specifically about openings in chess. And so I'm like, okay, openings in chess, is that like the non-fundies part of chess? And what I kind of came to is this conclusion that there's like a divide in most competitive games, not every competitive game, but most competitive games, between asymmetrical and symmetrical elements. And so when we think about asymmetrical elements, that's like Steve mining, it's Kazuya being invincible, it's Shulk Monado arts, but it's also like Lucina having a really safe down tilt, or a frame 5 up out of shield, or a super good juggling up air, right? And so there's some degree of asymmetry between all characters, but there's a great degree of symmetrical dynamics that everyone adheres to, even Steve, even Kazuya. And so these symmetrical dynamics, to me, that is fundies. Like if you want a definition for the term fundies, I would say it's symmetrical dynamics, which is very vague, but that's because fundies as a term has never been defined. Everyone's like, you got fundies, you don't got fundies, that is fundies, that's not fundies. What the fuck is fundies? So to me, this is the term that works. You don't have to use it, but it's what I'm going to be using. And so when we think about symmetrical dynamics that often come up, Charles actually lists a lot of them. And so the way I generally think about it is resource management and resource conversion. So two things: resource management and conversion. And so what are the main resources that you're dealing with in Smash? Well, there's two: space and time, right? We're hitboxes and hurtboxes traveling over space through time. And so how you manage your space and how you manage your time is generally the core of your fundies. And so a character like Steve breaks a lot of the standard ways that you manage space and time, because he can directly convert time into a unique resource that no other character has access to. And so Steve mining is not fundies because it is an entirely asymmetrical way to play the dynamic of time because of a resource that is exclusive to Steve. And so similarly, we can say Diddy Banana is not fundies because he's transferring time into an item that is unique to him. But at the same time, like, items are not entirely unheard of in Smash. There are more characters that have items. And so we could say Diddy Banana is not entirely fundies, but it is more fundies than like Steve materials because like it's an item, right? And items are a symmetrical element in the game. There are more characters with items. You'll see it more often in the game, is more common. Whereas Steve mining is entirely self-contained, right? And so we have this idea of resource management. So things like, and we're thinking about time. We're thinking about are you more preemptive or reactive, right? So those are two ways to use your time. Are you more slow or fast? Those are two ways to use your time, right? So slow moves like landing aerials that take more time to set up, but then are safer, or fast moves like dash attacks that are faster, but then less safe, right? That's the dynamic of time that everyone plays. There's no character in the game with an entirely safe dash attack. The closest thing is like Pac-Man or Donkey Kong, but they require like specific spacing, and then you're, you know, again, like we're doing some pretty fundamental stuff to make those things work. And then there's, for example, the speed of play, right? So how quick are you in your decision making, and that goes more into your mental resources, right? So again, we're thinking about converting mental, we're converting resources in general. So we're managing our mental resources so that we can properly convert like these decisions into speedy decisions or into more calculated decisions. Then there's like dynamics of space. So you can think in terms of space, you can think about your distance relative to the opponents. You can think about the distance relative to the stage. These are, again, dynamics that everyone deals with. Then you're thinking about your spacing, your movement. These are all ways to interface with space that, again, every character deals with. But then there are some characters that deal with these dynamics in unique ways, like Min Min and Steve and Mega Man being able to walk while they use their attacks, which is, again, very self-contained. Or a character like Steve who can build a wall and just change the space dynamic entirely because there's a fucking wall, right? Like that just fundamentally changes how you traverse space. And so when you like the players with fundies are the players who play around these dynamics well, who manage their resources well, space, time, but also mental resources, right? So something that is very fundies, I'm sure you guys would agree, is reading your opponent, right? Like that is a fundamental skill of almost any competitive game. And so optimizing your reading is in essence resource management, right? Like what are you paying attention to? What is important? What do you value is important? How much effort do you put in proper valuation? What is your refresh rate, if you want to use Pink Fresh's term, which I think is great, very apt in describing a way of managing or talking about managing your mental resource, right? Because when you go for a higher refresh rate, that requires more of your mental energy. So like, should you do that? Should you focus on like refreshing ASAP when you're playing your round one? Probably not, right? So that's like another fundamental skill. Like how well are you managing all of that? And so there's translations here, right? We can use mental resources to improve our space dynamics. We can use our space to get more time by retreating. You can use our time to traverse space, and we can dip into unique resources too, if we're looking at the more asymmetrical elements, right? And so fundies to me is these symmetrical dynamics where you're managing and converting resources. Often these are abstract conversions, so you cannot say like, oh, I'll convert one space into one time, or I'll convert one thought into one dash or whatever. You know what I mean? Like these are very abstract conversions, and that's what makes it so cool when someone is good at fundies, because their brain has figured out a system to compare apples and oranges, and it's accurate. Like, what the fuck? Apples and oranges, right? Like, it's inherently not translatable, it's not convertible, but they found a way to accurately estimate an accurate conversion, an efficient conversion that is generally favorable. And so when you look at someone with good fundies, generally they play these dynamics of time, space, resources very, very, very well. And characters that have tools that kind of disrupt the way that most characters interface with these systems generally are less fundies if you want to go by that definition. So especially Steve, again, because of mining, because of walls, he just generally disrupts the way that most characters interface with time and space and resources. Yeah, and there's characters like Kazuya too, who just like generally, like another thing, like another resource that you're working with is your percentage and your opponent's percentage, right? So like oftentimes like your options change very drastically based on percents. For Kazuya, well, 99% of the time he wants to get electric, right? And so that's like another like dynamic that he just does not interface with much. And so you see that from these newer characters, because the design space of traditional interfacing with these dynamics is so explored between like long range character, mid range character, close range character, and then there's like fast long range, slow long range, fast mid range, right? And so there's like this time and space dynamic is it, like all permutations are. I don't want to say all of them are explored, but it's very saturated. Oftentimes, what happens is they just have to figure out new dynamics just for a character to stay fresh, like Charles said. And so you find like the newer the character, oftentimes the less fundies they are. I'm also in the camp of saying like I think Sephiroth is like fundies, but he's like his own brand of fundies, right? Like he is interfacing with time and space the way a normal character would, but the way he does that is unique. Like there's not a lot of characters with that frame data or that range. And so while you can say, well, Seph is fundies, he is, but he also has like crazy range and a crazy short hop and crazy startup and wing and you know like an extra double jump, like all these resources that are relatively self-contained and unique to the way that he plays the game, right? And so for every new character there's some degree of this, and I think that's cool. I think the characters that interface with fundies in traditional ways but with tools that are unorthodox, like Sephiroth, I think those are the coolest characters. I think Shulk is very similar, where like Shulk interfaces with fundamental parts of the game, right? Like Shulk has the space because you can shield grab basically all of his aerials except for like Nair, and like up air, I guess. But like if you're getting up aired, cringe. Point is, he still has like his unique resources, like his Monado arts, like his weird frame data, like his big range, like you know, unique moves like his up out of shield, like very unorthodox long range out of shield option, that change the dynamics, but they still mostly coincide with the base dynamics, similar to like a Diddy Banana, where I think again Diddy Banana arguably not very fundies, but still very close to fundies, and items are so baked into the game. By now you've probably learned how to play with items. And so because it's such a common topic, yeah, I know, Tony. We hope that by now you've learned how to play with items. That he still interfaces with a lot of fundamental aspects of the game. And so yeah, that is my take on what fundies are. Again, I don't care if others use this definition. I think it is, to me, the one that works best. But yeah, that is my take. What do you think, Tony?
So I have a much more generalized and layman view of it, mostly because I have a lot less education than Ramses. But the idea I like to look at it is more of how do we make this into a functional model that we can then use to recognize fundamentals. And in order to do that, we first want to identify why do we want to identify what is fundamentals. And that is essentially to recognize or categorize these skills that we want to transfer. And essentially, fundamentals to me means how we would be able to transfer these skills among other skills within our life. And so obviously we're primarily here playing games or video games, but ultimately the purpose of games is as a relatively low risk means to investigate real life applications. In other words, games are ultimately simulations for us as advanced thinking creatures to live lives in advance, and so that we can go ahead and run into the problems and then solve those problems in ways that would probably be lethal if we were to do it in real life, and having competitive rock climbing competitions on a cliff. So with that in mind, I usually like to look at it as a pretty broad view and then work our way back down to a more specific thing. So the idea here is we're generally going to have global skills. So these are going to be things where you can take them through life in any avenue. So this is things like positive mentality or productive mentality, rather your ability to refocus yourself and stay focused on your goals, much like what we were mentioning earlier, to stay focused on that engine. If you have that skill, whether you're wanting to go into business, sports, if you're wanting to even just lay in bed at home all day, the best way that you're going to be able to do that is if you have your goal in mind and you can doggedly pursue it to the exclusion of distractions. And so that is an example of a global skill where it doesn't matter what activity or competition you're facing. The best version of yourself is probably the version that can stay focused without distraction. And so narrowing that down so that we're having specifically competitive skills. So things where you're going to take a population and then sort that population. Again, this is going to bring us to the point where the best version of ourselves are probably going to be the ones that can develop a process if we did not already have one and identify what components of the process are essential. And so the idea here is most top performing athletes or competitors are essentially self-coaching, self-governing creatures that have an internal system that coaches, even if they do have other coaches outside of that. And so the idea here is that they're generally going to have enough experience and critical thinking to actually identify what their process has to have, what parts of their game plan for existing has to have. And so an example of this would be like, if you understand that ultimately having a skill is about identifying what skills you need, progressing those skills to continue improving, and then staying on that for long periods of time to let time do its work, then it doesn't matter whether you're an Olympian medalist or a Smash player. If you really reach the peak of that point, you're going to be able to go into any field that is a similar level of competition, and you're going to probably dominate if given enough time, because it's only a matter of time. Your development is assured because the system itself is going to carry you through so long as you can identify those points. And then to narrow it down further, once you get down into specifically video game competitions or card game competitions, we can narrow that down to a more specific set of skills further. So the idea here is, for example, it doesn't matter what your ability with your legs or feet are, because the strongest competitors use their fingers in both of these pursuits. It's not that you can't, as a competitor, play with your feet, whether it's card games or video games with a controller. There have been examples of players playing with their mouth, their toes, whatever. It is possible to play with these. They just fundamentally tend to lack dexterity, or it could even be that the population size for it is so small that we haven't had the peak performance. You wanted to say something, Ramses?
You said the word.
Oh,
Fundamentally.
fundamentally.
Oh my God.
Yeah, there we go.
Playing with your hands is fundamentals. Here you heard it.
There you go.
Fundies.
We're doing it. And so what makes hands better than feet generally, first of all, we haven't actually gone through and scientifically evaluated to see whether or not it's possible to play games as sufficiently as we can with our feet, because socially we are conditioned to play with our hands. So whether it's true or not, hands are always going to dominate because they are the skill we begin developing for those contexts as early as possible. And so all else being equal, we're always going to start out with a head start on hands. And so the idea here is, what hand dexterity have you developed up to this point when you first decide to pick up the controller or the card game? And generally, if you already have prior experience with that, you're going to seem to be a prodigy at this point, because the idea is you're going to have skills that aren't necessarily perceivable to those around you, but nonetheless have an impact on the activity. And so, in other words, this is going to be athletic ability. This is essentially what it comes down to. And to go into the chess example, an example of something that isn't restricted to chess, but is nonetheless respected as chess is, for example, memorization. You can have a chess prodigy who comes in and is able to seemingly just soak up the game like nobody's business because they have practiced that skill of recognition and repetition from other pursuits, but you're not necessarily going to recognize that if they're playing chess for the first time. If you like watch them learn the rules in real time, then all of a sudden they seem to suddenly reach an advanced beginner within a short period of time. They're going to seem to be just a groundbreaking prodigy. But in practice, it's simply a logical progression of, if you have skills and you increase your skills, you get better, actually. So recognizing how those skills apply, we then narrow it down so that we're only looking at chess, or in this case, obviously this is a Smash channel. So that Now, once we get down to this view, we're going to get toward where Charles's perspective comes into play. Like if you're looking at what skills are going to transcribe into every Smash game, obviously being able to move your control stick, like these are being able to time things. These are skills that are going to be applicable in every Smash game, regardless of your character. And so the idea is to take Ramses' symmetry into mind. Essentially, the idea is this is going to apply to the better part of 200 characters. And so if the same skill applies to the better part of 200 characters, then this is a manner of symmetrical skill. It's something that both you and your opponent are supposed to practice to essentially equal degrees, even though not every character is going to use that one-to-one as much as the other character. And so the idea here is still that we're going to know that if you have those skills and you were to pick up a character, even if I've never seen you play that character, your fundamental skill is going to tell me that you are a head start because I have perceived that you've used that elsewhere. And so to narrow it down, as Charles said, you then start to look at more niche skills. Like, for example, your ability to multi-shine with Fox and Melee doesn't necessarily mean that you are going to be a good Kazuya player, but when we look at the actual athleticism required to execute Kazuya combos, ultimately what filters people from playing Kazuya, and it's not simple a matter of, oh, well, I'm just, I would never play something so boring. That is a very light filter. I'm sure there's players who say that or feel that way. But at the end of the day, the difference between top Kazuyas and not top Kazuyas fundamentally is going to be, can they execute the strict timing technical windows? Do they have the requisite athleticism? And if they don't, do they already have a system in place to acquire the athleticism necessary to do so? Like, for example, to go back to the Olympic medalist, if I were to give a GameCube controller or Smash Rocks or whatever to an Olympian who has never touched that controller before, there is 0% chance that they will, could probably even within a week, they would probably not be able to execute a Kazuya combo. But I have absolute faith that if we were to give them enough time and instruction, that that person would become probably better than every Kazuya player we have currently. And the idea here is that we already know that they are capable of adhering to a challenging process and to remain disciplined within it. Therefore, we know that if that process does apply to Kazuya and can graduate, then we can predict that given enough time, they will. And so the question is just predicting what that endpoint would be and how close to the end road of Kazuya are we? And I would say we're not very close to that. Therefore, I would predict that the best possible Kazuya player in like 5 years would be an Olympian starting and picking up a controller for the very first time right now. And so to use like the Min Min example, my first thought when I saw Min Min, because my human pattern-seeking brain naturally likes to look at things and compare them to fundamentals that I've seen elsewhere. My first thought when I saw that was, oh, they made a character with a better Meta Knight forward tilt. And so I was really curious as to, so within the context of elective multi-hit moves, so this is going to be your Cloud Side Bs to a degree, Meta Knight forward tilt especially, and then to a lesser degree between those two moves in terms of leniency and control, you're going to have Min Min's moves. And what I am using to judge this is essentially how dynamic can those timing windows be. So, and the reason we care for that is the wider the time range, the more that you can mix up the timing, which means the more ambiguous fundamentally your opponent is going to be and less likely they are to guess correctly when they are trying to read you. To go back to the old who, what, when, where, why, how example of what we're using it, the more of these questions we can answer and the simpler those questions become, or the answers to those become, the more likely we are to read that. So in Brawl, it was entirely plausible to dominate your opponent in neutral using Meta Knight's forward tilt, which was a, I believe, frame 3 move that was minus 17, but you could also imply the threat by pressing another Meta Knight forward tilt. And so the idea here is that if your opponent hesitates to wait and see something, then fundamentally, because you are now reapplying the refresh rate, what it was a very unsafe move becomes practically safe because of the implication of a further attack that they could interrupt into. This is traditionally known in fighting games as a rekka. So the idea here is, I forget what the literal translation of that is, but Ramses, you speak Japanese.
I don't speak Japanese, but I think it's based on Fei Long's multi-hit special, which was called the Rekka. That's the Rekka Ken, if I remember correctly. So it's based on the name of Fei Long's move, if I remember correctly, which is exactly what it sounds like. He like dashes forward and he punches you, and then he can do it multiple times if he presses the input again. And so it's exactly like it's a jab 1-2-3 mix up essentially.
And so the reason that we refer to this is, and the reason I refer to this as Meta Knight 4 tilt from Brawl and not Meta Knight from Smash 4, not Meta Knight from Ultimate, or not Jab 1-2-3, is because the context adding to this is range, the where of it. So it's not just the when that must be dynamic, but the where. How much can you imply the first hit, and also that first hit must be faster than the opponent's refresh rate so that they cannot react to it. And so this combination of things, I saw this on Min Min, and I was very interested because I was like, I can see, having personally experienced using Brawl Meta Knight's board tilt, I immediately saw myself in Min Min's trailer just controlling people from the full stage. And so my question was, how relative to the refresh rate is this going to be? How dynamic is my window going to be? And so that was the very first thing that came to mind from before the character came out. And then I played her, and the dynamic window is much tighter on certain things like smash attacks. There can be lockout windows where she essentially has to commit without being able to fully react to your response. And so essentially, this is closer to being a symmetrical situation than it appears to be. It's not like Min Min can simply just press her second button on reaction to you jumping. Usually what you're seeing is the Min Min player is having to predict while the opponent is also having to predict. So both players are playing a guessing game, and it is closer to being symmetrical. And so we don't get quite the level of domination from Min Min in practice that we would if this were true. And so this is an example of me being able to apply a Smash fundamental from a previous game and predict that into a future one, because at the end of the day, note Charles mentioned Tyrant earlier. Tyrant was a Brawl Meta Knight who is typically viewed as having strong fundamentals, who can then play future Smash games and also perform well with relatively or apparently little effort, not because he's just naturally got it. It's because his skills are transcendental in a way that allows him to fundamentally apply skills that he has practiced prior and then put them into seemingly new situations. And so, again, we get this illusion of prodigy once we take someone who has practiced these skills and then applies them into a seemingly unrelated skill. And essentially, that's actually how we can, with hindsight bias, recognize how relevant a skill was by taking someone who seems to pop up out of nowhere and then looking at their background. Essentially, the idea is we want to look at, well, what have they done before? Because we now know that those skills probably transcribe into these skills and translate into this performance. And so to narrow that down and to go back into specifically like Kazuya, for example, the idea here is that you can start to look at the weight of a skill. And so the idea here is that even if you have one of the best movement players on the planet to pick up Kazuya, moving with Kazuya does not transcribe one-to-one. Good movement using Kazuya is not going to give you the best Kazuya movement. If you look at how Riddles moves, and I would argue that Riddles is, if not the best, then very, very close to the best at movement with the character, he is not using traditional movement. He is not using traditional finger movements. Athleticism is counter-conventional. It's like if you were running, but you were doing so on your hands. It's not that you can't be good at it. It's that if you were to take the best runners, they're only going to be probably above average at running on their hands. And it's going to be because some of their implicit understanding of how running dynamics work, also probably having other parts of their body and above average shape, et cetera, et cetera. It's not going to be because their primary tools are going to directly apply here. It's more so just the implication and side skills that they have acquired are going to translate and give them a head start there. And so the idea here is that we recognize, well, if those don't apply one-to-one, then that means that Kazuya's movement skill is decided by a skill that only applies to Kazuya's movement skill. Kazuya's execution skill can be related to prior skills, like previous athleticism and other technically tight areas can translate as a head start, but they're going to do so more as a sub skill rather than a direct one-to-one skill. At the end of the day, the people who have direct one-to-one prodigy with Kazuya are essentially going to be the players who are accustomed to making the athletic motions of Kazuya. So sometimes literally, I have seen FGC players play Smash Kazuya and play as if they have played the character for quite some time with little to no experience of having played the character. Essentially, with small amounts of instruction, they have proven themselves to become above average players. And it's not that, oh, well, Kazuya just carries that hard. It's that Kazuya is a vehicle for them to express skills that they have learned outside of Smash into not one-to-one, but nearer to one-to-one than usual. And so their years of experience are being conveyed and so what happens is typically when you take someone with years of a skill that translates very closely to one-to-one, is not just that you're going to see them come out of the gate fully formed, it's that essentially at the start of their playtime, they're going to be operating on a positive multiplier. So it could even be 2 times as fast or something of that nature, just as an example. And so the idea is they're going to improve twice as fast as someone else would at that point until they essentially reach the point where that skill is developed outside of the game. And so the idea is, picture it as this would be, to get us into a different controversial topic, this would be the FGC years of practice acting as a talent going in. And so the idea is that talent is going to provide them an extra big glass to fill. And so even though you are essentially both putting time into that glass, if you are pouring milk into a glass and it's twice as wide, you are going to be less hesitant to tip the pitcher over a little bit. It's going to be a little bit simpler to pour that milk in. And then while you're pouring the milk in, you're probably going to get more milk into it. And so it's going to look like just 2 different people sit down, put in the same amount of time, and then one of them just gets outrageously better and does so outrageously faster. But in practice, it's more a matter of, again, applying fundamentals from elsewhere and just recognizing that that is what it is. It's an outside fundamental skill that transcribes, even though we didn't think that it did. And so I think most commonly where this goes into things like the talent versus fundamentals is
Talent versus fundamentals. Oh my God. It's a new discussion.
That talent is ultimately a fundamental that we did not previously recognize as having been practiced. And so recognizing or identifying that there is a talent usually comes down to us being able to then know that we should look into closer detail to identify where this came from, essentially, in terms of specifically relating to skill sets. So that's my perspective of what fundamentals is.
Okay, so clarification. Is it in the system that you're describing, is it possible for someone to have these skills that are applicable to, for example, specifically Kazuya or specifically Steve or specifically Min, but they're not necessarily fundamental skills in the context of Smash?
Can you repeat that for me? I'm sorry.
Right. So if you think about it this way, right, a fundamental skill in Smash are often skills that are relatively universal, right? Symmetrical to some degree. And so there are people who translate skills outside of these more universal skills to more asymmetrical, more unique characters very well, and through that do well without us recognizing those skills as impactful, because we're not used to seeing those skills lead to great results. You're saying that those skills are fundamental, but are they necessarily fundamental?
So what I'm saying is that they are fundamental on a gradient. And so the idea here is that if we're applying the microscope, what amount of zoom do we need to apply to determine what is fundamental to that scenario? And so long as that skill is essentially encompassing what we see within that microscope, it is fundamental. But if you were to zoom out, it will probably stop taking up the entire view of what we're microscoping onto. Does that make sense?
To some degree, yeah. I think. Let me think. How to phrase this?
I mean, so saying like some things are more fundamental than others, but like
Yeah.
Yes.
but technically everything. It's kind of like the item analogy where it's like technically are
Right.
items like symmetrical? Not really, but there's a group of characters that have it. So it's items are more fundies than Steve mining or building terrain, or actually, well, building terrain is it's like Steve is kind of in his own ballpark, but like there's other characters like Pac-Man is the only other one, right? But it's not to the level of Steve, right? Steve has way more options and controls. So, but it is part of the game. So, are Tony? Are you saying that like Steve mining is technically fundamental, but you just have to like crank the scope like maximum, and then like bang, then we see it, and we're like, okay, yeah, it's in there, it's in the game, but like Steve's the only one that can do it, and he warps like X, Y, and Z to do it.
I'm
But it's
saying that
fundamentals.
a Mario main is less likely to pick up Steve and do well than a Crag main is likely to pick up Steve and do well, because the skill is
Oh, I see, I
fundamental,
see.
but not necessarily within the context of Smash. So if we zoom a little
Yeah,
bit further out, we'll see there's more color on a different side of the circle.
for sure.
But if we zoom into only Smash, then we're going to see just this small little area. And so the shape of the color itself, or the color of the fundamental, is going to change based on what zoom we're in. But if we
Okay.
were to zoom in so far as to say Smash has always been and is exclusively Steve, like if we had just had 10 years of Steve and only Steve, we would probably view fundamentals very differently because we would be looking at it under a different lens, is
Right.
my assertion here.
Yeah. Okay, I get you. I think so to me like the term fundamentals is often contained within a game, right? People talk about like fighting game fundamentals, Street Fighter fundamentals, which are different from like Tekken fundamentals, right? But you can look at like you can zoom out as far as possible and generalize everything, right? Like at the end of the day, we make distinctions that are not necessarily there, right? Like the distinction between my bed and the pillow is one that I devised. Like there's probably a culture out there which looks at it differently. I know there's like cultures who had like the distinction of non-binary people before that became like a cultural subject in the West. And so distinctions at the end of the day are very man-made, which is why a term like fundies is so freaking hard, because people have like we have this feeling of fundies exists, but it's so vague and the lines are blurred so easily that it's very hard to talk about. Which is also why it's fucking lame when you get at someone for not having fundies. Like, come on, dude. Like, people are just trying to play. There's a very clear like negative bias right now, which is I think totally lame because the lines are so blurred. And like I said, right, like Steve mining, I think it's under my definition, it's very not fundies, but it's still interactive like standard. It's still a standard like fundamental concept. Like you're trading time for a resource, right? Like that is something that you're doing when you're moving around as well. Like you're using time to traverse space. And so in that way, it is fundies. And so I agree with Tony. Like if you zoom in enough, anything can be fundies on any like on a lot of skills. But at the end of the day, for the sake of the conversation, I think it's like I personally draw a line between like what fits within Smash and what doesn't. Because I think it's interesting. It creates interesting conversation.
So I specifically discussed yesterday with a top player about developing their ability to respond to platform drop scenarios by playing soccer. And so our remedy to, or one of our remedies to the situation was for them to play more soccer. And then we talked about specifically how they are cognitively processing their reactions within that context of soccer to continue developing that fundamental skill so that they can react to angel drops. Well, different angel platform drops. There we go. So that's an example of how untethered my perspective of fundamentals is relative to games. So
it's fair, right? Like they're skills. At the end of the day, they're all skills,
yeah.
and how symmetric or not skills are doesn't particularly matter. And yeah, you can practice a lot of skills without engaging in Smash. I do think there's a lot of value in engaging with them in Smash because the context is a little bit more like it comes up more
Defined.
often. Yeah, exactly. And so like you learn within the right context, whereas if you learn out of context, you have to apply context in the future. And it has benefits too, because you get a more like pure view of what the skill is without the context kind of like muddying the waters. But I get you. So, Tony, what do you think? Okay, Annie, actually, for both of you, I want to hear Charles because we've heard Tony talk for a while. What do you think
You're
is the
talking.
most? Yeah, I mean, we can go around the horn. Charles, what do you think is the most important fundamental skill in Smash, in Brawl 4 and Ultimate, respectively?
I think the easiest way to tell if someone has fundamentals in any Smash game is how successful can they be with multiple characters. I think that's a
Ooh.
very easy way to tell, and I'm not even going to say like specifically spacing or specifically movement. Like I can look at a player, and again, I particularly find Fighter Pass 2 frustrating, but when I say if someone like doesn't have fundamentals, I'm not gonna like go up to him and be like, "You don't have fundies, you fucking suck." Like that's not how it works. You know what I mean? If there's certain things about the game that are making you feel frustrated, you don't have to play the game, bro. Like you know what I mean? Like you can take yourself out of the environment instead of putting yourself in the environment and being negative towards others. If people are enjoying the game, then let them enjoy the game. You don't have to like waltz up in there and be like, man, fuck this game and fuck everyone else here that plays this character or this character. Like, you don't have to do that. So if you feel like you're getting to that point, because I definitely have gotten to that point playing, multiple Smash games. There's times where you need to either like take breaks or like take an exit. There's nothing wrong with that, right? Like you don't have to force yourself to play a game you don't like. At the end of the day, if you're playing Smash, you should be playing it because you enjoy the game. And obviously, the game changes. So even if you like Smash your entire life, something can change about the game, and you can be like, okay, well, I'm not feeling it right now, so that's cool. I don't have to play the game. So I agree with Ramses. The culture behind like, oh, you have fundies, so you're quote unquote good at the game, or you don't have fundies, so you're quote unquote bad. It's like, oh, okay, so you play a character that has very unique tools and you're able to win with said character. It's not like we're playing a squad strike tournament, right? Like in my opinion, if I wanted to find out who had like the quote unquote like the fundies tournament, 5v5 squad strike, no echo fighters. Boom.
I hear you.
Yeah,
I
and
think that's
then I
cool.
mean, it would be nice if squad strike worked better, if it was like not it was a bit cleaner. You know what I mean? But
Yeah.
uh that's how I would figure it out, and that's why I think it's very common for a lot of people in the community to be like, "Oh, like Tweak and Leo, they got fundies," because when you look at Tweak and Leo's uh resume in terms of like what characters they had success with, how many characters they got in the top eights with, how many characters they won tournaments with. Like, we got top eight with Banjo when he first came out. You know what I mean? Like that's like one of many accolades that he has. Leo won Genesis with mostly Ike / Lucina. Like, what the fuck? Ike was not that good, and he still,
Bad.
yes. So it's like all of these things, and then I mean, look at Zachary. Zachary's another player that exudes the vibe of Leo Tweak when it comes to his character pool. I think it would be silly to say that these players do not have fundamental skills because they were able to bridge their Smash skills into multiple characters and show that they have success with them. So I mean, even like look at Spargo. He wins like coin boxes with like Piranha Plant. Not all Piranha Plant, but still, it's pretty crazy the amount of characters that Spargo is picking up, and very similar to the other three players that I just mentioned, we see Spargo kind of going down the same path where he obviously had this huge come up with Cloud, but then expanded on some other characters and stuff like that, right? So I personally think that is what I would gauge fundamental skill with, is just how wide of a variety of characters you can play and how well you can play them in general. And then, I mean, if you can't do that, there's nothing wrong with that. You know what I mean? If there's a specific character that you like to play the game with, and that character plays very much more unique than all the other characters, right? Like Kazuya, Steve, what I mean, I'm just trying to think of characters that warp the game. Sonic, Snake, like all these characters are really strong. They don't play like any other character in the game. And I think that's a good thing. I mean, do I want a Smash game that every character does the same shit? No, of course not. That'd be boring, right? So, and I mean, even like Fox is a character that warps the game too. There's not a lot of characters that can do things to your shield and can move as fast as Fox and have like different lingering options, stuff like that. So I mean, even the character I play warps the game in a way that, I mean, I think there are other characters that are similar-ish to Fox. Like, I mean, Greninja is the first one that comes to mind and stuff like that. But even then, they're pretty different. So, and that's a good thing. That's a good thing, right? So, I would never use fundamentals to diss someone. That just doesn't like make sense to me. Even though I'm not gonna sit here and think and like say I've never done that before. Obviously, I've done that. Especially like if you're frustrated. I think most of it comes out of frustration, right? Like you're frustrated
Yeah.
against this specific character archetype or mechanic, so you might say some mean shit. But I think that it's not the correct thing to do, and I think you can take that somewhere else, or you can choose like to take a break from the game or to not play the game, right? If it's like frustrating you that much, it's like it doesn't give you an excuse to be toxic. This topic should not be a outlet to be toxic. I think that's the main thing. But
You
yeah,
hear that, people in the comments?
Yeah.
Don't be hating. Don't
mean,
be hating.
what are your thoughts, Sony?
So, the first thing I'll say is that I think what really changes more than people might realize is essentially what things like stage control mean is actually different in every single Smash title. Like, for example, N64, you not having full stage control or hitting someone while you're in the corner does not mean you're not going to take their stock at 0 if you got your combos down on lock. So, whereas an ultimate part of the reason you want to have stage control is because things are either going to KO or not KO under almost any circumstance based on whether or not you have stage control. So, keeping that in mind, then you go into games like Melee, where stage control is actually entirely different, where one of the worst positions you can have in other games is the strongest position, where they have to have rules specifically limiting your ability to abuse that point, like in Melee. So, Melee is kind of almost inverse, and then on top of that, things like platform pressure. Platforms are, to be fair, I remember when Melee did follow relatively normal stage dynamics, so perhaps it'll actually turn out to be the other way around, and Ultimate is just a young game. But the idea is Melee has evolved what stage control really means, what an effective player is going to be doing through the decades that I have watched it. So going into Brawl, I think that Brawl, more than any other game, even at the end of its mainstream lifespan, I felt that almost everyone who played the game was not particularly good at it, and that there was just a handful of players who were okay and passable. And I remember explicitly saying in like it would have been probably like 2013, 2014, that I felt that if Brawl were given the same population size as, say, well, I guess League of Legends was just coming up then, but essentially a more mainstream competitive game, that the players that we had at the top at the time would have essentially just become essentially pools level players. And so my perspective of Brawl was very different, because recognizing whether someone was good or not, if you go back and watch some of the best Brawl players playing the game, you'll see them just spawn and just walk back and forth in place without any attention to fainting out on their opponent whatsoever. Like, there's just so much game that's not even being played during the Brawl match. So even now, when I watch some of the top Brawl players playing, I see exceptional amounts of opportunities for both players to improve. So it's not a linear case of, as your game gets older, that things are going to change. It's a combination of age or time with the population that is playing the game. And obviously Melee is more of an outlier in this case, because there are so many people who play Melee and have played for so long that it is far and away the most advanced Smash game, despite being younger than 64, for example. So going into Smash 4, same thing, except I would say Smash 4 is the most dynamic Smash game by a mile and a half because it is closer to being something like a puzzle game in terms of fundamentals. Hitting your opponent on the first opening, for example, doesn't necessarily mean that you're ahead because of the way the rage system works. So not every character had access to being able to push an advantage to take the stock. And in many cases, sometimes if you weren't able to do that, then you would actually give your opponent the ability to do so when they normally would not have been able to. So if you and your opponent both hit each other, the person who hit second is probably the person who took the stock in some matchups. And so on top of that, stage control works differently than any other Smash title and is less universally applicable than any other Smash title because something like if you're engaging with Bayonetta, for example, on the top battlefield platform, you're probably making a mistake because that is one of the worst positions you can be in to engage with Bayo. That is not necessarily going to be true if you're playing against, say, Luigi. You would much rather engage with Luigi at the top of battlefield platform, but if you then run into him off a middle platform, for example, and give him enough space so that he can combo onto the top platform, that would change. Whereas, say against Sonic, those are specifically the places you would rather engage Sonic. So the idea is these are entirely different meta-relevant characters that you want to engage at different places that have different concepts of what stage position can mean. And this specifically came up recently when Sonics and I were going over preparing for those who don't know, there was a Smash 4 coin box with I believe it was a few $1,000s prize. Sonic's fully prepared for and was ready for the bracket, and I believe succeeded. And one of the main questions was we took into question certain assumptions that we had based on what is good play and ultimate, and then Sonic's explicitly took through a list of some of his assumptions and was asking me, hey, is it what might change whether this is good or not in Smash 4? And then we would essentially have a back and forth conversation discussing the dynamics and how they changed. And so the idea here is that we wanted to look at what skills actually were universal within Sonic. And so even Sonic to Sonic, not everything is one-to-one going from Smash 4 into Ultimate. The game is very different. Again, taking the opponent's character into consideration changes the context of what Sonic is doing, even all else equal. It can both be on the same stage with the same characters. It's still going to change because the opponent's character might be different, essentially. And so just because Sonic has a different spin dash, for example, doesn't necessarily mean he wants to play a matchup differently because maybe being in shield against that opponent is a strong thing to do in the first place, contrary to Smash 4's reputation. The idea here is that everything requires nuance and attention. Now, as we go into Ultimate, the first thing I look for is essentially on a philosophical level going to be the first thing I look for in any competitive title whatsoever, and that is whoever opens by sealing the opponent's best option while establishing their own form of value and essentially reducing their opponent's ability to maximize their economy, like Ramses mentioned, with the minimal amount of time necessary to do so, as Ramses mentioned earlier on fundamentals. That is how I'm going to always identify the best possible player that I'm looking at in any given different game. Like I can ask someone about a game that I've never seen played before, ask them what the strongest things to do are and how you can stop the opponent from doing that. And if I watch a VOD and I see someone doing both of these things with the exact same move instantly right off the bat, I already know that this is one of the best possible players there can be because that is one of the best possible things you can be doing regardless of what other context that might have in detail. In Ultimate, this usually specifically shows is players attacking to shut off their opponent's aggression in a way that also positions them to immediately take center on reaction to the opponent backing off. So essentially setting yourself up so that you can claim what you want, close down your opponent for attempting to interact with you, and then on reaction to the opponent not doing anything to close you off, then taking what you want. And usually this will all happen within the first 30 or so frames of the game. And so the idea here and how this transcribes is essentially you want to have a flowing defense that immediately can convert into offense. So, like, for example, this would be represented as something like a cloud dropping through the platform with a forward air that drifts towards center. followed up by an immediate backdash that you can then turn into a dash dance to come back to center with a back air. And so the idea there is if the opponent ran off in full sends into Cloud to try and pressure him on the platform, they ran into the forward air. If they go down to see what Cloud does and they see their refresh rate acknowledges that Cloud has just forward aired, and then they go to pressure Cloud on the after forward air, Cloud preemptively has already purchased some extra stage control with that backdash, and then he can now start up his jump in with a back air. Whether the opponent tried to dash shield or not, he has bought himself enough space so that he is indifferent to what the opponent did. But if the opponent did the same thing where they drop down on platform and back off, his back air is going to now take him into or towards center, and he doesn't even have to press the back air because the jump essentially is all pre-configured. And then Cloud's refresh rate is just starting again for the third point when he's jumping. And so the idea is Cloud's preemptively dropping through a forward air, preemptively backdashing, or rather his second refresh point is going to be whether the forward air hit. And then he's going to backdash preemptively and start the jump. And then his third refresh point is going to be during the arc of the jump. Am I going to press A button? If not, I'm just going to empty land and then progress the game from there. But either way, Cloud is probably going to have stage control, probably going to have hit the opponent already if they're particularly aggressive, et cetera, et cetera. So those are my views on the different Smash games. Sorry, that was a bit wordier than what you were looking for.
It was very
I did be
technical,
talking.
but the technical stuff is why we love you.
So, what is your opinion on that, Ramses?
Oh yeah, true. So I think so this is maybe not the most important fundamental for each game, but I think the coolest, in my opinion, is when someone is good at playing around the opponent. Because I think that shit's hard. Because like whenever you learn something, right? What is the first thing you learn? You learn how to win. It's like when you get into like a race car, what are you gonna learn? You're gonna learn to drive to the finish ASAP. And so like that's the basic shit. Like, okay, how do I do my Kazuya combo? How do I do my Fox conversion? How do I edge guard? Like all that stuff, cool, right? Like it's nice if someone's good at it. It's very pretty. But it's the solitaire part of the game, right? Like, you know, you put the cards down, right? And it's very one player in that regard. But in those situations where you're forced to play around the opponent, the players who can use the situations to either dismantle offense entirely or turn it into their own aggression in smart ways. So not like brute force ways, not like, oh, I'm just gonna like sneak in a reversal and hope that you suck, right? But like, okay, I'm just going to hard read your offense and do the exact defense that counters that. So a good example of that would be like perfect pivot in Smash 4. People who did like landing area into perfect pivot and then like the opponent would do like a whiff and then you punish them, like that type of stuff. Raw, super cool. So I think that's like one of the coolest like quote unquote fundamental skills is like understanding, okay, who is stronger here? Okay, they're stronger, so that recognition at first, and also being able to turn that and like still recognizing your win conditions in those bad situations, I think is really, really, really cool.
Toss a grenade in your opponent's cockpit while you're jumping into your car.
The snake move.
Exactly.
Well, I think even when a game first comes out, we don't know what the fundamentals are. Like for an example, Ultimate began and everyone was like trying to run up shield. Everyone was trying to copy paste the fundamentals from Smash 4 over to Ultimate. And this is why I think Leo was so ahead of the curve when it came to winning and being as dominant as he was, right? I mean, obviously he's the GOAT of Ultimate for a reason. I don't think there's any other player that will replicate his dominance. I actually just don't think there's enough time left in the game's lifespan, probably. Hopefully. But he really showcased like movement was like a baseline one, but I think what he really showcased was his ledge trapping and his cornering. Everyone replicates that now. Like that is a very common cookie cutter thing. How, you know, like Leo, Spargo, and stuff like that do their corner and their ledge trapping, but who originated that? It was Leo. And he was doing it first, and he was doing it before everyone else. And the amount of consistency he got from it was insane. And then, especially post quarantine, everyone was like, fuck, man, like, that's how you do it. That's how you play the game. That's you play not to get reversaled, and you play for center stage and positioning. Because even if they get off the ledge, it doesn't matter as long as you're not getting reversaled in terms of positioning. And that particular thing, I mean, Leo innovated a lot of things in Ultimate, but I think that was one of the biggest ones where I would always see it in his gameplay, and I'm like, man, he is so good at just like not getting reversaled in that position, and he's so like I was seeing the consistency as the game was going on. So obviously it was really broken, but it took a bit of time for everyone to kind of adapt that play style. Now, obviously, Leo played characters that could throw out like pretty safe distance, even like a Joker back air disjoint is good enough for that scenario. And then you're having like the forward tilt to cover normal get up on reaction and stuff like that. But just the way he figured out that part of the game was crazy. And then even like when I think about Tweak was really good at doing like platform drop aerials. I think that was his thing in the beginning of the game. Like
Oh yeah, the Ivysaur full
yes,
hop back air, drop full back air. His full hop usage was crazy for sure.
right. And I feel like Leo and Tweak were so far ahead of everyone in the first year or two of Ultimate, and you could really see it because to me, they paved the way of like what is fundamentally good in Ultimate, and then everyone else followed suit. So it it's really interesting, and I really can't wait for the next Smash game to come out because I want to see who are the next players to go ahead and pave that. Will it be kind of like Ultimate, where it was just like, oh well, the best players from Smash 4 are going to be able to catch on really quick? Will will the top players of Ultimate do the same thing for the next game? Will it be the Smash 4 vets? Right? Who knows? I mean, I'm rooting for the Smash 4 vets. Obviously, come on, let's go Tweak Leo. I need to see
Let's go
them.
Void. Come back
Yeah.
to
Oh,
us.
Void would be nice too. Yeah. Void got second at Genesis 6. That would be hype. But yeah, those to me, it's weird because fundamentals are so important, but the creation of fundamentals are usually from innovative players, which innovation and fundamentals usually don't go hand in hand. But like when a new game comes out, that's when they are hand in hand, right? So I think that part of the game is really fun to watch because everyone's just trying to figure out the puzzle, right? The puzzle feels a little bit more solved now, but in the beginning it's like, oh snap, like what is good, what is bad, like which characters are good, which characters are bad, what aspects of the game are strong, what are not. So I'm really
Well,
excited for this game.
innovation is definitely a fundamental that you can see on a broader stroke. Like it's not. I don't think it is a coincidence that a lot of the players who usually start out strong out of the gate in Smash are also able to do that in other games, like your Debuzz, your Leffen, et cetera, et cetera. These are players who have routinely been able to pick up a new game and absolutely break it out of the box. So I don't think it's a coincidence that they just so happen to keep guessing lucky. I think
Right,
it's
like
more a
seeing
matter
what's
of their
strong.
process.
Right,
Yes.
right, like their I guess evaluation skills is what we would be if we were trying to be like more specific. It's like, okay,
Yeah,
bring up the game, play the game. Okay, what feels good and what feels bad, right? That's like what it really comes down to, that baseline
essentially.
feeling. And they've done it in so many other titles that it's just the process for them is a bit quicker, right? So yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I could
But
agree.
it's something they've practiced also.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
uh,
They have
the,
experience.
yeah.
Just, dude, if you're listening at home, just know whatever it is that you're good at, Tony thinks it's a fundamental skill. Like you're fundamentally good at whatever it is that you're good at.
All right, now we're gonna get into
If you just zoom out far enough, Tony, everything is a fundamental skill, right?
I have a very interesting view of the world. What can I say?
I'm not saying it's bad. I think it's a compliment. It's like if you're good at cooking, like, dang, you got cooking fundies. That's fucking raw. Let's
Practice,
go.
double down on yourself. Practice that. Practice that.
Exactly.
It'll carry you.
You have cooking fundies. Now get ready for cooking innovation. Like show the world what you got, please. I
Yeah,
think it's a positive thing.
I'll be walking outside and I'll just think to myself, this is exactly like cooking. If I just apply the heat principle and I realize, you know what, if I just let this simmer for 20 more minutes, this is going to be a good
Exactly.
walk.
So walking fundies, bro. I'm just
Yeah.
saying. Like I wasn't flaming you, Tony. I was being legit. It's great. It's a positive. It's a pick me up for everyone watching.
We're gonna extend the episode another 2 hours, and we're gonna go into life fundies. Everyone, just kidding. Well,
Yeah.
Life fundies.
Life fundies.
Don't forget to breathe.
How to ride a bike.
That is gonna be the end of the episode. I had a lot of fun. I know the other two hosts as well had a good time talking about fundies. Obviously, a very abstract term, but I think we did a pretty good job of breaking it down. Of course, let us know in the comments below what you think fundies are in Ultimate. Would love to hear your guys' insight. And of course, until next time, class dismissed.